warmth and growth and life in here. So you're gonna have to excuse me, I have a few notes on my cards just to make sure I keep on track, because there's a lot that I want to make sure that I cover everything and not get too sidetracked. So I want to start really by telling you more about like the overview of the exhibition itself and where the ideas sort of stem from. And really that comes from, obviously it starts with the work itself, which has to do with ruins. And this is also the starting point in the history of Romanticism in art. And that's really what I've been doing a lot of research on as well. And I'm interested really in that transitional period between neoclassicism and Romanticism. And it's interesting how this sort of larger public narrative of neoclassicism and like this history painting that you might see here, really with their extreme depictions of like landscape, of war and history, of different depictions of what's going on in society at the time. What I was hoping to do was to sort of transform this and kind of show it in that context, but make it into something that's more of a personal narrative, and making something that's more with a sort of contemporary point of view, which I'll hopefully explain over the course of the talk here. So it's interesting to me that a lot of the Romantic painters were actually trained in the studio of Jacques-Louis David. Like Eng was trained in his studio. There's other artists that obviously weren't, like Delacroix and Géricault, but it's interesting how a lot of these artists both addressed these classical notions of this history painting, but also infused it with like chaos and emotion, sort of standing towards something that was becoming more Romanticism in art. And that's really what I'm interested in, is sort of this formation and combination of sort of sense of order that you would see in these works, and also the sense of chaos and emotion throughout the works. But what I do is take this perception of maybe like an epic history and transform it into something that's also at the same time maybe something that's much more personal or private. So with Romantic art, the kind of the main thing there is the sublime, this overpowering sense of nature. And J.M.W. Turner is actually a good example of that, and another artist that I'm interested in. And he's really showing the sense of emotional intensity and also melancholy at the same time. And so with that work and this notion of the sublime, sort of man overcoming, or man being overcome by nature, this is where this sort of moss comes from, this sense of nature consuming something or consuming the object. So it was important to me with the works that the moss actually be real. So it is real, it is natural. It's not necessarily growing at the moment, it's dry, but it's produced with all natural materials. It's adhered with rabbit skin glue, which is also natural. So that was important to me, in contrast to the rubber leaves here as well. So in contrast, also dealing with that is this notion of this classical idea of the importance of drawing from life and drawing from nature as sort of a source image for the work, and also for your artistic educational training. And that's also something that goes into why I chose to work with nature in this. But then we have this sort of alternative and sort of completely opposing idea when we get to postmodernism and also into contemporary times. But really it started with postmodernism, where you have the sense of appropriation and endless duplication, and the sense that nothing can be made new and everything's fake or remade. And so that's where we get to the leaves that you see below here, and also in the back. These are all they're actually casts of fake leaves. They're not even real, but they're supposed to look real. So I actually purposefully chose the cheesiest place I could think of, which was Walmart. I bought some plastic leaves at Walmart. I added some wax to them to make them look creepy, made a mold out of them, and then cast as many of them as I could. So here we have the purple and the blue here. And so I really like that if I know that you guys want to touch them, they're actually pretty delicate. They're really floppy. Here, I can show you. So if you see them move, they're kind of weird. I like the strangeness of them, but also the sense that they're sort of mass-produced at the same time. And also, with that, the fact that they're trying to be something that they're not at the same time. So the sense that they're, fake nature trying to sort of be nature. But I made them blue on purpose to sort of also play with that. So again, the sense of consuming and duplicating the real to become unreal and fake. And this, I see really as part of, American culture. I was thinking a lot about, this questioning of, the sort of past of romanticism and where we've come to today. And so the whole exhibition is really a play on these oppositions. So we get back then to the Salon Style grouping of these crazy paintings. These aren't my paintings in the back. I went to Iowa, my family's from Iowa, and there's really fantastic thrift stores and antique stores, and I had a great time shopping for the perfect landscapes. So this is kind of my own sense of American history, and I was thinking about, this idea of the ruin. And I actually have done quite a bit of travel, particularly to Eastern Europe, and it's interesting how in those cultures they really live amongst these ruins. In major cities you're going to see, like in Budapest where I traveled, there was a little Roman town called Aquincum, even to the side of the city. And these people live amongst this, and they feel natural, and it's just part of, their culture and what they know. Whereas in the United States, we have ruins, but they're not just so in the middle of the city, for instance. They're not necessarily as easily accessible as they would be in other places, because there's not quite as many of them.
Gallery was a ruin until we renovated it.
Well, it's more of a contemporary ruin, right? I'm thinking more way back in the past. So I was thinking about, what would be the sort of American ruin, and you think, about these sort of mass-produced objects and also these things that you see that are consumed but then discarded in thrift stores. And for me, these are all sort of idealistic landscapes for a person, a place where, they would hang this on their wall and they would feel a sense of escape, or, feeling like, that was their vacation, even though they're working every day, because we're always workaholics here, right? So that's kind of where those come in as well. So with that, then we have this idea of kitsch, and then thinking back into the past, this long history of romanticism and how we've been around it for a long time. These ruins almost become like kitsch because we've seen so many of them, and they also become almost sort of consumed and reconsumed themselves. And so in that sense, there's a little bit of a mourning of more of this aesthetics or beauty, a sense of beauty, when you start to compare, these kitsch elements with the paintings themselves. And also, that's kind of a more sort of broader area, but also I think about it in terms of this notion of this sense of loss or a loss of history, and I then transform it also into something that's personal within the paintings themselves. And it's also interesting too, I've done a lot of research even on the microbial degradation of paintings in terms of paintings over time eroding and our loss of those historical works, and what does that mean in terms of our loss of our sense of identity and our sense of history as a people. I do study abroad in Italy, so I've done a lot of research and looking at these things, and have been really fascinated by sort of half-completed frescoes and things that have eroded, or things that have been destroyed by wars. And it's interesting how even in these works, these battle plans that you see that I'll talk about later, those are from wars as well. And so the way I think of the work in general is in a whole lot of overlapping and multi-layered and interconnected way, sort of like a web-like pattern where this larger description of the installation will then lead into the smaller painting, and the smaller painting then leading out as well. All right, so that's kind of like my sense of the totality of the installation. Let me have a drink. Any quick questions before I go on?
No, because I'm sure you're going to get to it after, so I won't even
Okay.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Degradation of the paintings, what will the moss do to your paintings?
Well, the moss won't do anything because it's dry, but I had thought about actually trying to grow moss on paintings. That was another idea that's coming. I thought it would be great to have fungus, but that's kind of, I don't know, that'd be great though, right? So that was an idea, you got me there.
You're trying to reimagine the sublime. Do you want us to have a sublime experience in this exhibition?
I suppose in some ways, the sense of the largeness of the scale and feeling like you are being consumed as the viewer at the same time. So I guess maybe it's that notion of this idea of consuming things and you being consumed, which I'm interested in. Any other questions? Okay. So with the individual works, I'll talk a little bit more in depth about them. I think with this piece, this was some dream of mine ages ago. So thinking about the way that I do things, I tend to think big, I guess. So when I was young, I was 21. It's interesting, I was from Iowa, a small town. I had never really done anything in my life. I was in college, and I'd never set foot on a plane. And so I wasn't going to just set foot on a plane. I was going to travel somewhere big. So I went to Europe for 5 months and studied. And then my first experience of going to the Louvre, I remember that room of all of the David paintings around me, and I was with all these people who know nothing about art. I'm don't you know what you're looking at? Stuff kind of like that. And they thought it was crazy, but then I spent a lot of time really looking at these paintings, and I had this feeling that one day I would try to make one of these paintings. So here we have 17 years later, an actual history painting, or at least one that I feel is a history painting. So that's kind of where this piece in particular was inspired, just the most recent one, I would say, along with that one. So just talking a little bit about the individual elements within the painting. So like I was mentioning, there's a lot of layering and a lot of interconnections within the things that I've utilized within the work to create the whole sort of conceptual idea behind it. So I think a lot about cycles and patterns and repetitions in life. So you have the patterns in each particular work, and these are all based off of particular historical patterns from different cultures. I do purposely borrow them from historical patterns from architecture and from textiles and different things that I found from different cultures. So they are certainly important. And then going with that in terms of patterns, talking about the swimmers. A lot of people ask me if I'm a swimmer. I'm not a swimmer. I just use it as a metaphor, really. So I was thinking about, how we go through life, and when you're in water, it's more of this metaphor of life and death. You can either be drowned and die, or you can be reborn. There's we come from water when we were born, and also, certain cultures you're baptized with water. And so water is this sort of ritual element to me, which I think is really interesting. That can take on a lot of different forms. But also when you're swimming, I think about, in order to keep your head above the water and to keep breathing, you have to do this sort of repetitive motion. You have to keep moving your arms back and forth or kicking your legs, and if you stop doing that, you're going to sink and you could possibly drown. And then I started thinking about how this is kind of a parallel to what we do every day in life. Like every morning we wake up, we take a shower, we brush our teeth, we get dressed, we go to work. We do our job in order to pay the rent, to do what we need to do to keep living. If we stop doing those things, what would happen? We might become homeless, we might get sick, we might die, or whatever. So it's this sort of nature of repetition, which I think is interesting. So I utilize the swimmers as a metaphor for that. And also you'll notice that sometimes, not in all of them, but sometimes swimmers have certain devices that are sort of helping them. I think that woman back there, She has these things that are flotation devices, you know, sort of holding her up. But at the same time, I think of them almost as barbells, also as a weight. So this question of whether this thing is helping her in life or maybe being a deterrent in some sense. And you also consider, you know, how you compare yourself to other people. You know, some people might seem like they're, you know, they've got the easy way, or and these kind of devices are my way of sort of showing that in some sense, whereas others might really struggle, like maybe like this woman over here. She's having a hard time. Anyway. So the other element, obviously, of all of them is the ruins. So these are actually compiled from at least 3 or more different sites. They're never one location in particular. And they're taken from a lot of different sources, from hand-colored postcards and also different tourist images. And this, I think, that's kind of like the sense of contemporary ways of doing things, and also the sense of history, where almost everything in my paintings is appropriated, but when you see the totality of it, it looks very natural, like it wasn't, like it could be a space. So I'm really interested, I think it's really great when, you know, maybe someone comes up to me and asks me where the place is, you know, or says I've been there, and I think that that's perfect, because that's exactly what I want, because they could never actually really have been there. They would have had to have been in like 3 different parts of the world at the same time to actually see each one of these sites. But this shows me that, you know, I'm getting across this experience of place. And I'm also interested in the different levels of experiencing place. So you think about, you know, you might be deciding, hey, I'm gonna like go on vacation, I'm gonna go see this thing. And you have this book knowledge or of something, you know, what you think you know about the place, and then you might go online and virtually travel to that place and learn a little bit more. And then you finally go to the place and it's completely different than maybe what you expected, right? And then when you're there, you buy these little trinkets, right? You buy like tourist postcards, you buy like snow globes and lots of crazy little gadgets. And then you go home and then you have this memory of this place. But then that memory gets distorted by these gadgets that you purchase, right? And so that then turns into something that's more of a fantasy to me, and that's kind of how I think about these paintings as well. And I like this idea of like building the work on these perceptions of place. That's how I think of the layers in the greater sense, I would say. So in the end, you have this sense of memory or nostalgia or personal invention of a site or a personal connection with it in a different way that distorts that place. And that also then leads back to this notion of romanticism, which also deals with nostalgia and the ideals of sight. So the other element is this sort of more sort of private internal narrative that's suggested. So again, I'm dealing with these contrasts within the work, emotion and confusion, desire to escape, feelings of strength and loss. And you can see that, you know, sometimes in the gesture of the figure and the marks that are made, the color that's presented. So power and powerlessness, also desire and hopelessness. So I'm interested in this tension of contrast within the work itself as well. And also taking this external public imagery of like this epic history painting and utilizing this to express that something very internal and also very private, or this personal struggle. So also other elements within the work, you'll see lines, like I sort of mentioned. All of these lines are taken from specific battle plans. I purposefully use actually land battles. I don't want to use ones that are taken from the air. I want them to be battles where, you know, those that are fighting would have to stand in front of one another and see who they're confronting, right? So face to face. So in that sense, to me, they're like lines of communication. I think a lot about, you know, how we might be talking to one another and maybe misperceive one another or miscommunicate, or how these emotions come out in that way. Even though we might be speaking the same language, a lot of times someone might say something and the other person completely interpret it completely wrong. So those things are really interesting to me, and that's how those come across. The other element are the dots that you would see in the piece. So sometimes they're connected to lines, sometimes they're not. So I mentioned like snow globes. Those originally came from this notion of snow globes. I did a residency at Yaddo quite a while ago, maybe 10 years ago, and there was this poet that I met there, and he shared this poem with me one day that had this image of, or this narrative of himself as a child and the snow globe, and it really helped me to try to figure out how to get this more sense of fantasy in the work. So that's just an indicator of that, sense of imagination in the work. But also, the ones that have the lines connecting, I was also thinking about it in terms of a game. Like that one in the back in particular. I have a 6-year-old daughter, for those of you that don't know me. And I've been to the dentist and the doctor with her several times. And whenever you go, there's like this children's play area, and it always has those weird wires with the beads that they pull along it. And so I was thinking about that when I started doing that. And then I also started thinking about, even adults, how they play games, and also this sort of how communication can become quite difficult at times. Excuse me, I need to drink. Any other questions real quick? Okay, well, that's almost all the elements. There's one other thing that you'd notice is probably the sort of crazy stuff up there or around in the piece. So this abstraction I see more as the emotional point in the works. And it's more like interference or complication, the overwhelming nature of emotion. And a lot of times in the works you'll see it kind of like maybe hovering over a figure's head, or the figure is kind of maybe battling against it in some way. And this is kind of our desire to sort of push aside some of these emotions at certain times. And then we have the painting within a painting. So this is coming in different forms within the work. So you have it in this one. So I had a few pieces before this where you have a little bit of a vignette. Where this is for me, I think is like the escape for this particular figure, the sort of endless landscape that they want to revert away to. And then also, it's transformed also into a type of an homage or an actual painting within a painting. If you look over here, this is actually a Turner painting within the painting. It's called Shipwreck at Sea, I think. Did I write it down? Oh, it's on this sheet. I'll get the title for you, I'm sure, right? Disaster at Sea. So it's all this section and then a little bit up through the sky. And then also the painting in the back there, the title of it is Ophelia. And that's actually an homage to John Everett Millay's Ophelia painting. So it's my own kind of personal version of it. And a little bit of background about me, I have an English Lit degree, so I've always been interested in language and dialogue, and so that's kind of where it comes from. I actually did a course where I read all of Hamlet's tragedies, so you can see all the tragedies here. So we have there's this vignette from Hamlet's play, from Act 4, Scene 7. And Judy here has promised to read this for me. It's a dialogue between Laertes and Queen Gertrude.
Did you want me to read all of this?
Can you?
Yeah.
If you can.
Okay. Sight reading, musician. Drowned. Oh, where there is a willow grows askant the brook, that shows his hoar leaves in the glassy stream. There with fantastic garlands did she make of crowflowers, nettles, daisies, and long purples that liberal shepherds give a grosser name. But our cold maids do dead men's fingers call them. There on the pendant boughs, her crowned weeds clamoring to hang, an envious sliver broke, when down her weedy trophies and herself fell in the weeping brook. Her clothes spread wide, and mermaid-like a while they bore her up, which time she chanted snatches of old tunes, as one incapable of her own distress, or like a creature native and endued unto that element. But long it could not be, till that her garments, heavy with their drink, pulled the poor wretch from her melodious lay to muddy death. Alas, then she is drowned, drowned, drowned.
Great job. Thank you so much. And related to that too is like if I reach way back in my history of painting, when I started painting, like way back when I was young in high school, I was from a small town, so there wasn't many art classes. So the way that I learned to paint was actually through the theater. So in high school, I did at least 2 theater set designs per year. And so I was used to this like epic way of painting and thinking about space in that way, where it would be the scrim in the background and then these props and these characters. And then also thinking about the dialogue with it as well. And even today, like when I'm painting the paintings, I often like listen to the dialogue of old like black and white films when I'm painting. So it really definitely resonates for the work. And that was kind of where I'm going to end it, if anyone has their additional questions after that. Anyway.
That's so cool. I didn't know that about your scene painting background. That clicked something into place for me about you. That's so cool.
That was new to me too.
I thought about studying that when I was an undergrad, actually.
Yeah.
Where did you start when you're building up all these layers of these paintings? Like, just all these are so intricate. Just kind of baffling.
I think the process kind of comes over time. Before I was doing these works, it was actually depicting more realistic spaces with the swimmers and the historical Turkish baths that I had visited when I was in Hungary. But then I just got really frustrated with the naturalistic space. I wanted to break out of that and do something more, creative. But it was still always layering. So I just was thinking about still this sense of history that you get from those, but reforming it in a different way. And that's how the ruins kind of came into my mind. Usually I let things roll around in the back of my brain for, a year or so before I actually throw them into the work. And my previous solo exhibition was the first exploration of this style. So I think with this group, you've seen a real progression in my thought process with these. So over time, things sort of shift and change and get more complex. I mean, I do sketches, I do a lot of research. I did watch a whole lot of YouTube videos on how to grow moss. Read articles about how oil paintings erode over time with microbial elements, and so you do this research and then also your own sketches and collecting images and then compiling them all together. So that's kind of how it builds.